That's the way to Bristol, that's the way to London. Behind me, about 10 miles away, is Oxford. And right here is where the old Didcot to Southampton line used to run. And there, behind me, is where Didcot Station used to stand. In the latest rebuild during the 1980s, British Rail renamed it Didcot Parkway. I don't know why. This is how Didcot Station looked in 1852, 8 years after it had opened, by which time it had become a busy junction on the Great Western Main Line from Bristol to London's Paddington. From here, you could catch the Exeter Flyer, which would take you the 53 miles to London in 55 minutes. Today, the same journey by high-speed train will take you 45 minutes. 10 minutes less. The name has changed, the buildings have gone, the trains are different, but the spirit does live on. Over there, at the Didcot Railway Centre, home of the Great Western Society.
You mention Didcot to anybody who has had interest throughout the world in railways, and they know of us, and along with the power station behind us, we're the two big attractions in the area.
Now celebrating 20 years at Didcot, the Great Western Society has flourished, and since those first faltering steps, has now become one of the largest preservation societies in the world.
The origins of the Great Western Society go back to 1960, when British Railways published a list of locomotives that they were going to preserve as part of what is now known as the National Collection. And myself and some colleagues of mine who in those days were schoolboy train spotters, who used to watch the trains go by at Southall, decided that it would be a good idea if we could buy a 1400 class auto train locomotive and auto coach, because we felt that that was a gap in the collection that had been announced as being preserved. Not really knowing very much about it, we thought, well, all we have to do was write a letter to the railway press and the money would come pouring in. I think probably as 17-year-old schoolboys we didn't really recognise the full ramifications of what we were letting ourselves in for. We found after a few years that there was a lot more interest. We had other people come on and we launched other funds for other locomotives. Certain other locomotives were bought privately by individual members. And in fact, locomotive 6998 Burt Magnus Hall was also one of our very early locomotives and was brought out of traffic from Oxford Shed having hauled the last steam-hauled train on the western region of British Railways, and that was delivered down to Totnes, which in those days was our base. We found that the interests of the businessmen in Devon were not necessarily the same as our interests, and we were offered an opportunity to move our rolling stock up from Devon into Didcot Engine Shed in 1967. And we brought up the stock from Devon, the locomotives and 2 or 3 coaches that we had down there. We also had a locomotive and some coaches at Taplow just down the line, and they were brought here as well. And that was 20 years ago, was the beginnings of our occupation of Didcot Railway Centre.
In the last week of March 1987, visitors flocked to Didcot, the headquarters and showground of the Great Western Society, a mecca for the Society's 5,000 members worldwide. Despite the drizzle, the fires burnt furiously in all of the Society's 10 engines steaming that week, and over 100 members volunteered to run stalls, cater, administer, and manage the toing and froing of the celebration week. Whilst never far away, the work of restoration progressed.
Well, it was before we came to Didcot, when we used to have a little depot in the goods shed at Taplow. It's the old goods shed there, look. And we were in process of moving all the stock and everything, what we had at the time, down to Didcot.
2 coaches?
Not much. We were shoveling on coal for the special to run down the line to Didcot. So. And this is the 61 loco. And there's the stock we had then, consisting of about 2 coaches, plus a van we hired from BR to put all their sundry bits and pieces in. And that was about it.
It was built in 1931, I think. Society bought it in 1965 from British Railways, and it's been here. First it went to Taplow, and then in 1967 it came to Didcot. It was the first Society engine at Didcot, and it's been here since then. It was in service until about 1975, and we've been rebuilding it since then.
The livery this is carrying at the moment is the livery it would have had between 1944 and 49, and that's the nearest we can get to it in Great Western liveries, because they added various bits and pieces as the engine got older. It's all hand painted, marked out in chalk first and then painted on in enamel. The only transfers we use are the Great Western coats of arms, but all the lettering and numbering is all done by hand. Well, my trade is a draftsman during the week, so at weekends I'm the maintenance foreman here, and when they need an engine lettering, there's a couple of us that do it as and when. But obviously it's not needed that often because we only finish an engine probably once every 2 years.
Highlights of the week were the mass steamings, where the engines gathered to hiss and boil in front of the engine sheds, to the delight of the enthusiasts.
This loco 5051 Bristol Castle was run on the mainline expresses, hauling passengers down to the south. It mainly worked in the Welsh area, where it stayed for quite a long time. It was then renamed from Bristol Castle to Earl Bathurst, and then it was scrapped and taken to Dyewood scrapyard, where it was bought by the Miners family, who were very large and quite rich. And then recently Mr. Miner died, and the family was therefore forced to sell the locos. And the society launched a campaign, Castle Aid, and we're raising the money to bring the loco, make sure it stays here. It has been recorded unofficially that they reached about 100 mile an hour, but they could maintain speeds of up to 80 mile an hour without any trouble at all, apart from the sort of fireman collapsing every now and then in between throwing coal into the fire.
Well, actually it goes back quite a long way. It goes back to Longmore, to the days of the military railway there. There's a chap brought in a small 040 saddle tank there, and my colleague John has just gone down the way. We saw this locomotive and we thought, well, we could do this kind of thing as well with a small loco. So we had a look round and we happened to find that this locomotive was derelict at Southampton. So we bought it in 1968 and brought it onto this depot in 1969. And it's been here ever since. We haven't taken it out of the depot at all. We've pulled some real heavy trains, including Blue Peter we've pulled with that locomotive in this depot.
The shunting yard, which is now a mass of steam traffic, was abandoned by British Rail in the late 1960s. The Society have renovated and relaid much of the track and sidings in use today. Two of the lines are long enough to offer short trips, a chance for the visitor to experience the elegance and style of the Great Western Railway.
Built in 1936, it was originally numbered 4866. It was renumbered in 1948, I think. The engine was mainly shedded down in the Newton Abbot area. Normally worked on either the Brixton branch or was the spare for the Ashburton branch. But it was first engine bought by the Society back in 1964. Since then it's had two overhauls, the last one about 5 years ago. the last rebuild, it had all the rear end of the frames rebuilt totally, where the trailing wheels are, and the whole engine was stripped right down, had a full boiler repair, mechanical overhaul. It's got about another 3 or 4 years to do before it's due for the next overhaul. Normally has casual repairs over most winters.
Preservation doesn't just stop at engines and carriages. The Society has saved a whole station. It's true. Painstaking rebuilding has given Didcot's engines a charming halt.
This Didcot halt, well, we reconstructed this. The waiting room, as you see, that came off the Lambourne branch. It's what they call a pagoda-type waiting room. That came from the Lambourne branch. Signal box and radstock. The water tower, which you see down there, that is authentic. And the whole thing was reconstructed to be a branch halt in the 1930s, 20s, 30s. We took a prize for it because it's as authentic as really as things were, and it lets people see what a branch halt looked like in the 30s. Something you don't see today, of course. They've all gone, unfortunately. We're quite proud of it, very proud of it.
And every well-managed station needs a signal box. And every signal box, a level crossing.
Mind the gates, please.
Both can be found at Didcot, renovated to their former working glory, run and maintained by a specialist signalling group of the Society. It's difficult to believe, but this is how the Radstock box looked on its arrival at Didcot. This box, from Frome in Somerset, will soon be fully operational and then interlocked into the system.
Well, he used to work from the mid-30s right up to the end of steam on branch lines. And the idea of it was that you could drive from the engine, and when you got to the end of the branch line, You didn't need to turn anything round. You just got out the cab that end and come up this end and you could drive from this end. With this one, if I put too much brake application in, the train just comes to a stop because I can't recreate the vacuum. The fireman has to do that. So you've got to work as a team, though you're the length of a coach apart, and because otherwise we should just stop, short of the platform. I used to work up to a maximum of 4 coaches, but they'd only have the maximum of 2 behind the engine, which was worked off the regulator rod, because so if you had more than 2 coaches, the driver just could not pull it across. So if you have 4, you'd have 2 coaches at the front, then the engine, and then another 2 coaches. It was to make it a lot easier, otherwise you could never move this regulator handle otherwise. The only thing is the fireman has to use the reversing gear for you, and you do that by whistle codes, but it's quite simple. This is a whistle chain. You've got the net in it. So I always take it back the other way now. Whistle.
The Society is now in the process of renovating a second auto coach, thus giving them the unique honour of operating 2 of these eccentric but eminently practical pieces of railway history.
All he's got control of is applying the brake and opening the regulator. So he can put the brake on, but he can't take it off. So I've got to do that from there. It's roughly knowing where you watch the needles, the vacuum gauges in the cab, and see where he's making his brake application. You know where he's going to take it off. So you take it off for him. It's not completely automatic, it's about as near as auto as you can get.
Yeah.
Certainly as far as the Great Western was concerned.
I started off as a fireman at Fairford, and a cleaner of it, originally. I went to fireman and stayed there until 1962 when the line closed. Then sort of, the end of steam was near enough that, and that was I thought there's never, have a chance of getting on a steam engine again. And one day somebody just said, "Oh, you want to go down Didcot? They got a society down there," and I thought, well, it's not really sort of my scene, And I come down here and I spent about 2 hours down here, got terribly bored with the whole situation, and thought, well, I was glad when I go home. And then a few weeks later, I decided to come down again. I've been coming down ever since. And that was 1969.
lads, OK, tea break now.
Tea breaks offer the voluntary workforce of members the opportunity to swap stories and progress reports. Work weeks are special events to encourage members to get down to some hard graft. At weekends and steam days, visitors take priority. Part of the Society's rolling stock collection are these super saloons.
These coaches were built in 1932 and they put this kitchen in Princess Elizabeth in 1936. This is one of 3 ocean saloons at the Didcot Railway Centre. The third one, Prince of Wales, is undergoing restoration so that we can actually join it to this fleet. We have 58 diners coming for dinner this evening and we run our wine and dines once a month from April to October. They're usually quite full and people like to go somewhere different to eat, so we tend to find people who enjoy the visit round the Railway Museum and then coming and dining in the coaches.
Although at every turn an engine can be seen puffing away on its business, part of the Society's preservation philosophy is to recreate the total environment of the great days of steam. Flora and fauna are actively encouraged in Didcot's nature conservation area, where over 200 species of wild flowers bloom. But another greater blossoming is recorded here at the Great Western Society's Museum, the blossoming of God's wonderful railway. The practicalities of operating such a busy marshalling yard are immense, and items such as a turntable become invaluable. Unfortunately, British Rail took their turntable with them when they left. But eventually the Society did find one, rusting at Southampton docks. The 70-foot iron turntable was transported, renovated and reassembled at Didcot over a 2-year period. Much of the day-to-day positioning of engines and carriages revolves around this giant feat of engineering that enables only 2 men to rotate over 80 tons of locomotive, coal and water at the turn of a handle.
This engine, Burton Agnes Hall, was built at Swindon 1949, was used on the Western region on mixed traffic trains, and was the last steam locomotive running on the British Rail Western region, and was bought by us direct from British Rail after working a train from Oxford to Banbury, and we actually bought the engine in Banbury sheds on the 3rd of January 1966. It's been here for that entire period. We've done one complete overhaul on it when it was returned to traffic last year, and we are running mainline trains with it this year, of which there's a train out in a few weeks' time.
It was a sunnier day when a well-known and much-loved visitor to the celebrations was the LMS Princess Elizabeth. The Princess Elizabeth was one of the fastest express engines that ran between London and Scotland in the heyday of steam. Another welcome visitor from the Bulmers Railway Centre in Hereford was the King George V. The King George put on a really royal show. But all too soon, preparations were made for the engine's return. Guest appearances are no stranger to the King George. This giant bell on the front of the locomotive commemorates an incredible feat when the whole engine was shipped to the United States to take part in the Baltimore and Ohio Railway Centenary celebrations in 1927. But back to today, and the King George setting off for a major refit on what is likely to be its last run out on the main line ever. Well, here's to the first 20 years at Didcot. And here's to the next 20. But it's not over yet, for even at night, there's an opportunity for enthusiasts to get steam in their sights. It's 4 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Now normally the only sort of people that will be awake at this time of day are vicars putting the finishing touches to their sermons, or that strange brand of insomniac called the lighter upper. Fortunately for me, it was a warm, if wet, midsummer's morning, and the sky was beginning to glow when I went to the Railway Centre in Didcot, home of the Great Western Society. There I found Dave Martin preparing to light up the engine 6998 Burton Agnes Hall. And as Dave made the preliminary checks, we heard someone else approaching.
Hi Chris.
Dave.
Check the water. Brakes. Engines in mid-gear. Cylinder cocks are open. Right then Chris, we're going to put some old oil on this rag. Round on top of the wood. Just here and there. And when we light the wood, it helps it all to burn very quickly and the fire spreads quickly. Right, we got the matches then?
Yep.
Okay, light the cloth then. I'll stick this on the shuffle. Get it going nicely. And in we go. There we go. In about 3 hours, 4 hours, we will have steam. Burning well now. This is a problem, see, when you get the wind changing, you get the stuff blowing out this way instead of going out that way. First few knobs.
Having been at Didcot for 20 years and now a full-time staff member, who better to talk about steaming up and tell us the lightest tale than Dave Martin.
In this area, the steam engines finished in 1966, and the engine we're on at the moment actually pulled the last scheduled steam train on the western region of British Railways, January 1966. The Hall class engines were first designed by Charles Collett for the Great Western Railway as a development of the two-cylinder 460 engines, although they were more for mixed traffic rather than express passenger trains. There were 200 or so built until about the Second World War. Then the locomotive engineer became Mr. Hawkesworth, and he made certain developments to the design, and so this engine 6998 Burton Agnes Hall is actually the modified Hall class, and it was built early in 1949. With a bigger engine, we have to allow about 4-5 hours in the case of the very big engines to light up. It can be done quicker, but if you do that, you get a lot of heat in one place, and the other end of the engine will still be cold. And that causes a lot of stresses and strains, and we have to be very careful about that, otherwise you'll get leaks in the boiler. This engine we've lit at 5:30 this morning, and it will be ready for service at 9:30, 10 o'clock.
So what should we look for, Dave?
The water in the gauge glass starts moving gently. Maybe 1 or 2 little drips start coming from some of the joints on the back here of the firebox. And then a little bit later, the magic needle starts to move. Then after that, you'll soon have enough pressure to move the engine. And you wait for the scheduled crew to come take over.
But after so long at Didcot, doesn't Dave have any ambition to be a driver?
I drove occasionally in the early days of the society, but I dropped out of that side of things, and we have to pass very stringent training and examinations before we're allowed to drive now. First of all, you have to be a fireman, just like the old days. Although in the old days you would be a fireman for perhaps 20-30 years before you became a driver. But maybe it can be a little bit quicker here. A bit more coal is required. You have to keep looking at it, make sure the fire's burning correctly, and it's going to burn in the corners and right down at the front end of the firebox. In this one it's quite a long firebox, so once the fire is caught well at the back, then we push it forward and get the rest of the fire burning. See, normally you would throw the coal in, but it has to be very carefully placed to start with, so it catches properly. Yeah, she's burning nicely now. Light us up, just light the fire. Apart from checking that the engine has got water in the boiler, really that's all we have to do. The rest of the checks are done by the fireman and the driver when they come on duty at 8:30. The tender behind the engine, that's the old joke of course, the engine's got a tender behind. The tender carries 4,000 gallons of water when it's full and 4 tons of coal. This would be enough to give the engine a decent run up to Birmingham and back, and that would be in good condition. If, however, the engine was in poor condition, not steaming very well, leaking tubes, then perhaps we'd only reach Banbury and back.
Chris Race, at 13, one of the youngest members of the Great Western Society, is going to light up 1466, a favourite of many members. But Dave is always on hand to give out tips and hand on his years of experience to younger enthusiasts like Chris, a new generation enthralled by that golden age of steam. But what is it that drags a young lad like Chris out of his bed so early on a Sunday morning?
I'm 13 and I've been coming down for about 3 years now. I like these steam engines because I like the sound of them. They smell nice and I like watching them being driven, and I hope to be a driver myself. This was the first engine the Great Western Society bought with the auto trailer. What is it?
231.
231, and it was a load of schoolboys that put out the deal for it all. And that. And after we got this one going, we started buying a little more engines and coaches and all different stuff. You have to be a member to light up, work on the engines or anything else.
So, the future of steam at Didcot seems secure, but only as long as it still holds an appeal for Chris and his friends.
Yeah, this engine, 1466, was built in the 1930s, especially for branch line work, and it ran mostly in Devon, and in fact it ran on what is now the Dart Valley Railway for some time. That wasn't its only location though during its life. There are 75 of them, I think, altogether, spread over the whole of the Great Western system. There were some in this area at Oxford and at Reading. Small tank engine, 2 driving wheels and a trailing wheel behind. The water's carried in the tanks on the side and the coal's carried in the bunker at the back. They were used on the branch line trains, but they could, when occasion demanded, also run at a good speed. And the celebrated place for this was near Gloucester on the Chelford trains, when these engines used to keep up with the express trains on the next door main line. There are 4 still in existence: 1420, 1442, 1450 and this one. Couple of minutes break, cup of tea. The coal we use comes from South Wales. It's not domestic coal. It's Welsh steam coal. There are 1 or 2 collieries still open that we can get it from. It burns very hot and it needs a lot of air draft to make it burn properly. Great Western engines were designed to run on Welsh steam coal because the Great Western area covered the Welsh steam coal collieries. If you burn household coal in these engines, they don't steam nearly so well. If they go to other parts of the country, then the coal they're given is maybe Yorkshire coal or Nottinghamshire coal, and it's much more of a job to make these steam. They kept them in steam for 3 or 4 days, and they are just like a kettle. In fact, in German, the word for the boiler of an engine, locomotive, is Kessel. And just like kettles, they get furred up, they get lime. And about every 4 days, you have to take the washout plugs out and squirt water through the boiler for several hours to wash all the lime and scale out. And that puts it out of action for 6 hours, although it doesn't really get cold. And every few weeks there would have to be a more protracted stoppage for more careful checks and maybe repairs.
What's time, Dave?
7:15, mate. Another couple of hours, these will have to be ready. Every day there had to be engines lit, and when an engine came back in from service, most of the fire that was in it would be thrown out, or it had already been used, because engines were not supposed to come back in on shed with a great big firebox full of coal. No point. Otherwise you just sit there burning coal for no purpose. And coal is, and was, very expensive. So the engine would come in with a minimum of fire, and then it would be left like that until its next duty, maybe 6 hours later. This engine is called Burton Agnes Hall. The Great Western had a policy of naming all their main passenger engines after large country houses. They had the castle class, pollution at its best. Had other engines named after manors and granges. These were named after halls. They were supposed to be named after engines on the Great Western system. And in the majority of cases this is true, but by the time they built the modified halls they were getting a bit short of names. And actually Burton Agnes is in Yorkshire, so the connection with the Great Western is somewhat tenuous. I'm actually sat on the right-hand side of the engine, the driver's side, and the controls, the regulator, for opening up the steam to the cylinders. The reverser for controlling the manner in which the steam is used, also for changing the direction of the engine. The brake which opens the vacuum passageways and let air in. The blower control which increases the draft on the fire. The large ejector which sucks the air out of the vacuum pipes. And then it's the fireman's job to check the water level and the pressure. The Great Western carried on with right-hand drive right up to the end of their designs. Most of the other railways, apart from one or two smaller ones, had left-hand drive, where the driver sat and controlled the engine on the left. The big engine behind us is also named after a large country house. In this case it's Dryslewin Castle in Wales. This engine really, for most of its life, was called Earl Bathurst. The name Earl Bathurst was originally on a very small, old-fashioned looking engine, and the lords who had these engines named after them were a bit upset about this, and they pressed the Great Western Railway to put their names on rather more modern, exciting engines. And so the names of a dozen or so of the newest Castle class engines were taken off, and they were renamed after the Earls that were on the old engines. So Dryslewin Castle was only carried by this engine for about 6 months, and it was renamed in about 1937.
By 8:30, the sleepy railway centre is coming to life, and Dave makes some final checks before handing over to the fireman, Phil Bareham.
Morning, mate. Hello, mate. What have we got here then? Oh, very nice. Yes. Something horrible. Yeah, something of it, right.
The needle's moved.
Yeah, that's great, yeah.
You got
blower pressure.
You got half a turn on the blower.
Great.
The privilege of driving 6998 today falls to Alan Rose.
Morning, Alan.
But before she can move an inch, he has a very important task to complete. It can take up to an hour at the start of each tour of duty for the driver to complete his checks on approximately 150 different lubricating points, and not all of them easily accessible. The points are protected by a cork. A firm twist keeps them securely in place even when travelling at full speed along the main line. Well, that's the last one, and we're still a good half an hour away from full steam. "1466", a small but powerful tank engine, is now in full steam and stands by to gently push the Burton Agnes Hall, which has no power of its own yet, to the water crane. Before the coming of diesel, the 74,000 gallons of water in the tank atop the coaling stage was pumped from the Provender Pond, which was just across the sidings to the west of Didcot Station. But since the establishment of the railway centre, the tank is now filled in the more orthodox fashion from the water main.
Yeah, just from back a bit.
Introduced in the 1930s, auto trains were designed to be driven from either end, without having to turn the engine round. A forerunner of the modern diesel multiple units on today's suburban services. Fireman Alex Daniel.
In the old days, the crews would start off. You'd start off with the basic fireman. He would do trips up and down the line until he became fully conversant with all the signals, stations and that sort. And it wasn't until he was getting almost to the point of being a pass fireman, that is a driver in time to need, that he would be working on auto trains, because he'd virtually be driving the engine himself with the exception of the regulator. I'm that sort of person. I'm halfway between being a driver and a fireman, or rather fireman and driver.
The time is just after 9:30. The auto coach finishes its first run of the day in the hands of driver Peter Granston. Burton Agnes Hall. 6998 is at last ready to go out onto the main demonstration line for a day's steaming. It's now been exactly 5 hours since we first met Dave Martin, lighting up in those cold moments before dawn. And there's little more to say. I'm just going to sit back, relax, look and listen to the sounds of Didcot.
Doing it to deflect the flames that are near this end of the firebox, so I can see what it's like down the other end. Because I mean, you get holes down at the front, which can allow cold air to come through, and you start losing pressure. So I do that so I can see what I'm doing, what's going on under the firebox. Generally, when I'm firing, I'm trying to work from the front back, so the cold that hits the front ignites first, and you can't obviously see down that end, and then work backwards, and then finish up at the back. And make life a lot easier for yourself. As it slopes down towards the front, and a lot of the stuff you put on the back tends to get shaken down the front anyhow. So you tend to put more on the back and build it up around the back corners a lot in this particular sort of thing anyhow. It seems to work for me. So, 225 pounds square inch where red line is on there, and it's also where the safety valve lifts. That's a steam heat pressure gauge. In the older days they used to use steam to heat the carriages that went through a pipe on the back of the engine. And that indicates the pressure you've got in the system and the pressure required by these numbers here, depending on how many coaches you've got. That thing there is the water level gauge for the boiler. That's probably the most crucial thing. It's actually the water level above the inner firebox, because there's an inner one and an outer one, obviously, where the fire burning underneath and the water, and the outside on the top. And it has to be really inside, preferably in the upper half. If it drops too low, then you run the risk of damaging the firebox. But there's two plugs in the inner firebox that are lead lined, and if the water level drops too low, the lead would melt. And it would let water and steam into the fire, which would be a warning to sort of say, look, it's going too low. All these things are bits and pieces on the top here. That one there is the on-off cock for the steam heat that I was talking about a minute ago. And that there is the actual regulator, regulates the pressure for the steam heat. These three here are also to do with the injectors, which put water in the boiler. We've got an ordinary live injector, which is that one which takes steam straight out of the boiler and uses it to force the water from the tender into the boiler. And these two here, which work a thing called the exhaust injector, which the idea is it takes exhaust steam that's already been used in the cylinders and uses that to put water in the boiler, being more economical. It works somehow.
All trains stop here. Oh. And so they used to, forever. But not anymore. For these rusting hulks have been saved from the scrapyard by a group of enthusiastic railway supporters here at Didcot. You know, anywhere else in the world, this would be a sad sight. But not here. Not here at Didcot. These are waiting for restoration. Restoration has already started on this one, number 7202. But as you can imagine, restoration work of this kind takes a great deal of time and costs a great deal of money. Good luck. That's what it's like when it's finished. "5051, Dracillin Castle." Seeing it today, it's hard to imagine that only a few years ago it was being ignominiously towed from Die Whittam scrapyard in Barry to a new life in Didcot. Built in 1937 and condemned by British Railways in 1963, 5051 is a member of the most successful family of the Great Western locomotives, the Collett-designed Castle class. For the whole of its working life, it was based in South Wales, pulling express passenger trains to London and the Midlands. And although now normally carrying the name Dracillin Castle, 5051 was renamed Earl Bathurst in 1937. That name being originally carried by an apparently antiquated-looking locomotive. The Earl in question objected. Now fully restored by members of the Great Western Society, it once again makes a magnificent sight in the full splendour of the GWR livery. And since its return to mainline condition in 1980, has made several journeys on the very tracks from which it was once banished. But there's no smoke without fire. It was here, in the lifting shop, that 5051 started that long, slow journey back into service. Now, it's the turn of 5029 Nunney Castle to undergo complete restoration. This involves stripping the locomotive down as far as possible, cleaning, repairing and replacing worn and rusty components and lovingly reassembling the parts. Ted Lacey, lifting shop foreman.
Well, this is Nunney Castle. We started it about June, really started it about June last year. We've done the frames of this, bored the cylinders, bored the valve cylinders, machined the pistons and the piston rods. The boiler's got to be done yet. I've done brake valve and blower valve and fountain. Still got the gauge frame to do. To renovate the boiler, we'll have to have it off because you can't get all the stays down the sides. We'll have all these stays out, all these ones there, they're steel stays, which is just a threaded metal bar, neck down in the middle, just to keep the two halves of the boiler apart, the inner firebox and the outer firebox. And you can drill them out from this side, and then we get in there and gas them out from the back, and they come out quite easy like that because you can't gas out, you can't hurt the copper that way. What I'm doing at the moment is to flatten these faces off. They all look like that, where it's been out in the rain and all the rest of it, and it just eats it away. So flatten them all off so they don't leak. Nothing worse than a cab full of steam.
As far as is possible, the original parts are restored, but obviously those subjected to wear have to be replaced. As here, Peter Constance fits the original brake blocks using newly turned pins and washers.
That's the position of the pin in the brake hanger, and the block itself, which is the wrong way around at the moment, would be sort of hanging in that sort of position against the wheel. That is the position it would be in once the locomotive is running, and this arm will just move forward when you apply the brakes so that this rubs against the tyre on the wheel, and hopefully it stops the engine.
Restoration not only requires the skills of some members, but also the enthusiasm of the less skilled for the long, hard grind back to mainline condition. John True, GWS member.
We've worked on several engines here. Practically every engine that you can see that's in workable order has been worked on, and we've tried to do some part of each engine. Normally the odd bits and pieces, the fittings and the brake gear, all the bits and pieces that people don't see, and normally our job is to clean these bits up, get them into good order and then repaint them so that they can be put back onto the engine. Well, I'm working at the present time on 5029 Nunney Castle, and we'll carry on working on these until this engine's finished, and then we'll pass on to something else.
You would expect to see grown-up boys here, but grown-up girls?
I've been a railway enthusiast all through the last war. I used to collect names and numbers at Worcester. But what I'm working on are the two water valves. One is under the right-hand side of the foot brake. That is the live steam injector. One underneath the left-hand side is the exhaust steam injector. What I mean to say is this: you use a bit of exhaust steam when the engine is running, with a little bit of live steam to carry it on, and that's it.
Simple, isn't it? And so the work continues, burning, scraping, and grinding off the decades of rust. But when all the parts are put together, will it go?
It came from Barry. It wasn't in bad condition considering, but it's weathered over the years. It'll go.
Running a successful railway centre efficiently is rather like running a successful railway. Timetables are planned and adhered to. They have to be, together with rosters and schedules for the workforce. Otherwise, there would be chaos on this crowded site. Simply moving rolling stock from the carriage shed to the paint shop has to be planned well in advance. And despite using a powerful Hunslet diesel shunter, it is a slow process. John Minchin, another GWS member, explains.
Everything's always got to be taken at a nice slow speed when you're dealing with partly stripped down vehicles. You can't kind of run around at nice speeds, but also got people around, so just taking things nice and easy.
So what has drawn John to Didcot every week for over 15 years?
The whole thing with this movement is a lot of it is the restoration, but there's also a very good social side as well. So you don't want to miss Saturday nights in the pub.
Ah, but I think there's more to it than that. And there was. John told us just how he started with the society and what he does now.
Started off as a fireman, and I'm now a diesel driver as well. But my main work and contribution, in fact, has been on fundraising more than the operating, so I've got two totally different hats.
The society runs a bookstall which brings in precious revenue to cover day-to-day running costs, as well as helping to fund major purchases. But all over the site there are stalls and shops raising money for particular projects, selling anything from first aid covers to bits of old signalling equipment. The Bristol Group are currently raising money to fund the renovation of Frome Signal Box. The Bristol Group are in charge of signalling at Didcot. Also on sale are badges, posters, photographs, model trains and relics from the real thing. Hundreds of thousands of pounds have to be raised every year if the Great Western Society is to continue its work.
The thing is, I've got a shop to run on steam days, selling t-shirts and various things for the locomotive I've been involved with. 3822 is the heavy freight locomotive. I was involved with that right from the scrapyard when the society bought it in '75.
This film, made by Bill Seymour, shows in a few seconds the years of work that went into restoring this heavy freight locomotive. A collet design, based on the 28 Churchwood 1903 original, The 3822 was built in 1940 and has been painted in wartime black livery. A splendid sight.
A lot of our group have moved on to the other big freight engine we got here, which is 7202, and hopefully we'll be getting really stuck into that later on this year. But as with any of these projects, they take a lot of money.
7202, completed at Swindon Works in 1934, spent most of its career working coal trains in South Wales. Condemned by BR in 1964 after completing 650,000 miles of service, it was purchased and moved to Didcot by the Great Western Society in 1974. The heavy freight group hoped to have it fully restored in about 5 years.
I don't think a lot of people realise, but when you're restoring a coach, the actual costs and time involved are as much, if not more, than a steam locomotive, because to do it properly you need really good seasoned wood, or else it'll just need rebuilding after 2 or 3 years.
The carriage and wagon foreman is Phil Waterworth.
During the week, I work for British Rail as a carpenter. At weekends, we are currently working on the travelling post office. By the time it has finished, it will have cost something in the region of £12,000 to £15,000. We found when we came down here that no one really was interested in the coaching side. Most of the people, even today, are interested in the locomotives because they are living and breathing, if you like. Without coaches, you haven't got a railway and you haven't got a railway centre.
Looking as pristine and gleaming as the day in 1921 when it left the carriage works in Swindon, it would not be an exaggeration to say that 3755 was lovingly restored, especially when you look across the site to see its sister coach 3756. Both coaches arrived at Didcot in the same condition. It must be very rewarding to see the years of hard work, sweat and tears put to good use on steam days.
Yes, we are. All right, John?
You okay? Right.
Another long-term project is the 190 Auto Trailer. It arrived in fairly poor condition and had to be stripped down to its bare woodwork and virtually rebuilt. The exterior is now complete. But that's only half the job. Now the interior has to be accurately recreated. Already £15,000 has been spent on materials, and a similar amount has to be raised to complete the task. Restoration is hampered by the lack of original plans and designs, so work progresses by studying old photographs and relying on long memories. Most of the work is carried out voluntarily by members of the Great Western Society, but professionals are called in for specialised jobs. Like here, the seats are being rebuilt at a cost of over £4,000. Eventually, they will be reupholstered in specially woven, authentic GWS fabric at a cost of £15 a square metre. The intention is to restore it to full working order. The locomotive department are helping with the driving cab, which will be connected to a locomotive at the other end of the coach, allowing it to be driven forwards and backwards without having to turn the engine. But with the ongoing maintenance of the other rolling stock, labour and time are in short supply. So it'll be some time yet before we see 190 on the branch line. However, the work continues whenever time and money are available. Some of the restoration work is obvious, but it is often the smallest details which cost the most. These top lights were completely remade and fitted, with the replica springs and latches being specially made. The hanging straps were made by a local saddler. The brackets were cast by a local foundry. And the familiar drop lights recreated at a cost of nearly £100 each. But in the end, it would have been worth all the effort to see it bring pleasure to thousands of people every year, running up and down the branch line into Didcot Halt. These super saloons, named after members of the royal family, have been preserved in their original condition and now provide a splendid dining service for visitors to Didcot, in the same luxurious surroundings enjoyed by passengers on the boat trains to Plymouth in the 1930s. Even the kitchens are in full working order, and all the food is prepared in them by members, another fundraising activity. So both the internal detail and external appearances are attended to with equal endeavour. The collection of coaches at Didcot is probably the most comprehensive of any independent railway. Over 40 items cover the period from the 1880s to the 1950s, and those that aren't already will one day be restored to their original glory. And it won't be too long before the travelling post office is collecting and delivering mail sacks to the collection net once again. Meanwhile, the work continues, replacing rotting wood, rebuilding broken doors, and the seemingly never-ending task of removing rust from ageing metalwork. But coaches comprise only half the rolling stock. The Great Western Society also boasts a fine collection of old wagons. thanks to the enthusiasm of a very small team. Using photographs for references, they are renovated and painted, restored and repaired, with as much care and eye for detail as the locomotives and carriages. And when they're put together to form a train, double-headed by the heavy freight locomotive 3822 and 6998, Burton Agnes Hall, you could be forgiven for thinking you had stepped into the past.
Great Western Society Railway, in fact, had a number of wagons, and they gave them various code names. The particular wagon on the end with a veranda for the guard to act on freight trains is known as a toad in that coding system. And we've got a train here of about 10 wagons along with it, being shunted by 2 locomotives. They'll be about to stop in a few minutes to leave that toad there, and taking 2 wagons away from it to leave it with another pair of wagons for use later in the day. The wagon nearest the toad, the John North and Sons wagon, is done with was used for carrying coal. It's a local merchant from Abingdon-on-Thames from its livery. The next wagon is a Royal Daylight wagon for carrying fuel oil. As you can see, it has some early-ish style of lettering. That was in fact donated to the society by a petrol company. And the next wagon is a tar wagon, the Smith & Forrest Manchester No. 1. It's used at gasworks or time gone past when we were still producing coke and obviously other heavy-duty oils, and that would be used to take the heavy oils away. The next wagon on came from Fowey in Cornwall and was used for carrying china clay. It has a special design of door at the end of the wagon, this end, which opens so that it could be tipped to allow the china clay to be tipped into boats that took it away from Fowey. The next wagon on again is a ventilated van. There's a mica B, which again is another Great Western code in mica, for carrying boxes at the end for putting in dry ice, carbon dioxide, very cold, to help keep meat and that sort of traffic is hooks inside for hooking the meat on to keep it cool. The next wagon on again was used a lot at Bristol and other places in Avonmouth for carrying bananas. The wagon on again has in fact a rather unusual brake cylinder. It's an old Dean type of brake where the actual outer cylinder goes up and down rather than the piston inside as on the other freight wagons. And the last wagon beyond that again is a milk tank, which is in fact a southern vehicle. We couldn't get a Great Western vehicle. And that was used to carry milk around the country after they decided they weren't going to use churns anymore. Okay, stop there, Gordon.
Didcot's Catholic approach embraces this Thomas Smith & Son 5-ton shunting crane, which, although it runs on rails, was never intended for use on a railway. It's owned by Gordon Thompson, another GWS member.
I bought it myself in 1974. It used to belong to a firm of timber merchants at Barking in Essex called Thames Plywood. I think the firm's now deceased anyhow. It was really a redundant plant, and if I hadn't have bought it, it would have only gone to the breaker's torch anyhow. But I'd always been interested in steam cranes, in fact this particular make, ever since being a child, because I'm sure that you can tell from my accent that my hometown's Preston in Lancashire, and there used to be a local foundry there, again long since deceased, and they had one of these, and I used to watch it for many hours, either during the school holidays or on my way or to and from school. And I used to find them, even though it's a rather humble piece of equipment, I used to find them rather fascinating, and still do to this day, and it had always been my ambition to own one. So I used to work with a man who has a large showman's traction engine, and it was merely through the course of conversation that I learnt about this one's existence down at Barking. So I went down to see the people, and it just happened. It was during the 3-day week of 1974, and it had stood for a while, but they just pressed it back into service, and I asked them if they were likely to dispose of it, and in fact they said yes. And so I was able to buy it at its then scrap price, which was 28 tons of scrap steel. Well, this crane was actually built, you'll probably find it difficult to believe, but it was built as late as 1954. And the death knell of them, really, was the Clean Air Act. But the design goes back to about 1890. That's why it looks so old-fashioned, because they never ever changed the design from that original conception. Whoa, wee Morris. Okay.
Yeah, take it up slowly. There's no weight, there's chase.
This can best be described as a bus on rails, as Alan Machin explains.
This vehicle we are sitting in was built in 1940 and is a Great Western Railway diesel rail car. They were built primarily for branch line operations. It has 2 AEC engines and is a 48-seater. They were run all over the Great Western system, from London branch lines to places like Henley and Marlow, and they were used in Wales and as far north as Stourbridge and Shropshire. Of the 38 originally built, there are only 3 remaining. There's number 22 here, this one, the Didcot. Number 20 is on the Kent and East Sussex Railway, and number 4, one of the earlier streamline ones, is in the Swindon Railway Museum. This was quite an innovation for the time, the first one of these rail cars being built in 1932. The advantage, of course, is that they were cheap to run. They were quite easy to operate because the driver just walked from one end to the other rather than having to change the engine from one end to the other.
The best way to sum up all that we have seen is to take a short trip along the main demonstration line, starting as we leave Eynsham platform, past Didcot Parkway mainline station in the background. There are the goods wagons, the coaling station, a gate protecting the main line, and a GWR linesman's hut. As we travel past gathering speed, a timely reminder that Didcot is still a busy railway centre, both ancient and modern. And there is one of the Hunslet diesels being preserved by another breed of enthusiasts, the diesel and electric group. More derelict coaches and locomotives stand in line awaiting their turn. And look, there's the 72 where we started, in front of the original engine shed. The new yellow building is a much needed extension to the working areas and hides the original lifting shop where we saw the Nunny Castle. In the far distance, behind the super saloons, is Didcot Halt, a genuine taste of the Great Western Railway. The traverser is sandwiched between the turntable and the carriage shed, all under the constant gaze of Didcot Power Station. For here, at Didcot, a dream has come true, preserving the style and elegance of the Great Western Railway, the dream of 4 schoolboys. Thanks to Angus Davis, Graham Perry, Mike Peart and John Barlow, the golden age of steam lives on, and it all started 26 years ago.